Welcome to AEDT 4120, Serious Gaming and Simulations. Week 2, Analog Meets Digital, video clip 4 of 4. I'm Professor Bill Kapralos, and over the next few minutes, I'm going to talk to you about synergy, and more specifically, comparing analog and digital simulations in games. However, prior to doing so, here's the list of analysis questions for this particular video clip. Number 1. How does going digital change a simulation? Number 2, why were early simulations crude approximations of their analog counterparts? And finally, number 3, what are the differences between rules in a digital simulation or serious game versus the rules in an analog simulation or serious game? Analog meets digital, and more specifically, analog simulations in games meet computer simulations in games. In other words, we digitize or we introduce digital computers to analog simulations. When we look at computer simulations in games that were made for research and corporate and commercial purposes prior to the year 2000, there was a considerable difference with what is currently available, at least externally. And a large part of this is due, in fact, to the advances in computing hardware that we currently have available. Simulations produced most of their output in the form of numbers, while games included some form of visual interface. This was prior to the year 2000. In other words, there was a clear divide between games and simulations. Games were more graphical based, whereas simulations essentially produced their output in the form of numbers and text. However, this divide has eroded away, and currently simulations and games are very much intermixed. Simulations currently employ all these great advanced and high fidelity graphics and auditory cues, similar to games. In fact, many of the development tools used to produce games are now used to produce simulations. Early computer simulations, or sims as they're so known, they were basically automated versions of their analog counterparts. So they basically took the analog version of the simulation and produced it on a computer. And these were, in essence, very crude approximations. They lacked depth in almost any attribute, including visuals, interaction, the use of auditory cues, amongst others. And part of this was, in fact, due to the limited computational power available at the time. Even though we're looking at only approximately 12 years ago, computing power has changed substantially since then, and it has allowed us, as a result, to do things that were not possible or feasible back then. Over the past couple of decades, computing power has increased tremendously, and we now have the proliferation of the internet. What analog and digital sims share? In other words, what are similar amongst both analog and digital simulations? The 5 critical characteristics defined by Thiagarajan are common to all simulations and games. So conflict, challenge, constraints, closure, contrivance, and correspondence. These are actually present in all games and in all simulations, whether they are implemented on a computer, on paper, or acted out in real life. However, all of the 5 except for challenge are profoundly affected by going digital. There are some major differences when we do introduce the digital computer and we move analog sims into the digital realm. When we look at challenge, it's designed into the game or the simulation from the outset. At least it should be, whether it's designed for a digital or an analog platform. There are some fundamental differences between analog simulations and games and their digital counterparts. What are these differences? Or in other words, what are the effects of going digital? Well, there's a number of differences, and there's a number of issues that need to be addressed. We'll take a look at some of these here. One of the important things that needs to be considered is gameplay experience, and this is best illustrated through the use of an example. Consider playing a card game, your favorite card game, with a group of people in person versus playing that same card game with the same number of people but in an online environment where each of you are remotely logged in and playing the game. Playing this card game with a group of people in a face-to-face setting will be far different than playing the same game in an online environment where the same people are logged in remotely. Simple things such as looking for facial expressions change between face-to-face and online settings, amongst many other differences, of course. Another fundamental difference between analog simulations and games and their digital counterpart is with respect to what the participants, or the users of the simulation and game, can and cannot do. So consider the card game Solitaire, for example. A player can cheat at Solitaire when playing with an actual deck of cards. However, that player can't cheat when playing Solitaire against a computer or on a computer with another opponent. At least they can't cheat in the same manner. They have no control over the cards themselves, which are mediated by the computer. Something else to consider is the fact that there are some simulations and games that don't have an analog counterpart. For example, take some video games, Tetris, Mario, Ms. Pac-Man, Donkey Kong. They only exist in the digital realm, not in the analog realm. Just to reiterate, there are some fundamental differences between analog simulations and games and their digital counterparts. And when moving from the analog domain into the digital domain, things change fundamentally. It's not just a simple matter of taking your analog simulation or your game and creating a digital version of it. Although they may appear the same, there's going to be some fundamental differences, given the fact that we've introduced a computer in the mix. Computers inherently have limitations, and there are things we cannot do with computers. Furthermore, despite the great computing power available to us, there are environments, for example, that we can't recreate faithfully. And as a result, there will be things we cannot simulate, or at least faithfully simulate. In analog educational simulations, much of the detail on the original system which the sim is based is taken for granted and not made explicit. So for example, we can have a live simulation of an emergency evacuation within a workplace. And these simulations usually take the environment for granted. Obviously, in a live simulation, you have your workplace. It's a faithful recreation. It is the actual workplace. However, when we're simulating this environment, all of a sudden, this is very difficult to do. Take your typical university. It's extremely difficult to recreate a faithful 3D model of the actual university and have all the fine detail as it is in the real world. Not only is this time consuming, but faithfully we cannot do it. We don't have the computing power to faithfully do that, especially when the environments are very complex. Even though we can't faithfully recreate it, if we want to come close to it, it requires plenty of resources to actually develop the environments and verifying that the simulation environment is an accurate reflection of the model that is being implemented. This takes plenty of hours to develop and to create. And again, it's not going to be an exact replica of the real world environment. Of course, this may not matter and it may be sufficient, but it will never be a faithful reproduction of the real environment. So although there are some things that we can't necessarily do in the digital realm, or there's limitations to what we can do in the digital realm, particularly with respect to recreating faithfully a particular environment, there are also many aspects of a simulation that could never be implemented, at least ethically, in an analog simulation. So take, for example, toxic smoke, nuclear plant explosion or an accident, landing a plane in fog or adverse weather conditions. Doing this in the real world, in an analog simulation, is obviously too dangerous. It puts people's lives at risk. It's extremely costly, even if we got over the danger aspect. And secondly, it's also ethically immoral to do. But of course, when we're dealing with the digital domain or with digital simulations, there are no safety concerns. And there are typically no ethical concerns as well. So you can actually simulate situations which you can never really experience or at least recreate ethically in the real world. And this is definitely one of the benefits of using digital simulations and games for education and training. More specifically, they allow us to actually recreate these potentially dangerous, costly, and ethically immoral situations. Finally, the last difference between analog simulations and games and their digital counterparts that we're going to consider here is with respect to rules, and more specifically with rule enforcement. When we look at rule enforcement in a digital game or simulation, it's hard-coded. It's in the code itself, in the software. And typically this can't be changed by the player or the user. However, when we look at live action sims or analog simulations in games, although rules themselves do exist and have been written, they can be changed on the fly. So the players or the facilitator, they can actually change these as the simulation is moving along. However, in digital simulations and games, as mentioned, the rule structure is predetermined and typically can't be changed. This brings us to the end of our discussion on synergy, or the differences between analog and digital simulations and games, and it brings us to our list of synthesis questions. Number 1, digital simulations are superior to analog simulations. Do you agree or disagree? Explain and justify your answer. Number 2, what are the implications of developing virtual simulations and games for mobile devices? And number 3, no simulation can be truly realistic and all are biased. Do you agree or disagree with this statement, and explain your answer? And this brings us to the end of video clip 4. Thank you.